5 years ago, on a crisp October morning in the remote wilderness of Montana's Glacier National Park, 12-year-old Marcus Chen disappeared without a trace during what was supposed to be a routine family camping trip, leaving behind only his sleeping bag and a half-eaten granola bar. But when search and rescue teams finally discovered what had become of the boy after all these years, the truth was so extraordinary that veteran investigators with decades of experience still struggle to comprehend how a frightened child lost in the wilderness managed to not only survive, but transform into something that would challenge everything. They thought they knew about human resilience, courage, and the unbreakable bonds that can form between the most unlikely companions in the face of impossible odds. The story begins in the small mountain town of Whitefish, Montana, population 8,500, where the Chen family had planned their annual autumn camping expedition to celebrate Marcus's 12th birthday. David and Linda Chen, both software engineers from Seattle, had been making this pilgrimage to Glacier National Park every October since Marcus was 5 years old. It was their tradition, their way of disconnecting from the digital world and reconnecting as a family among the towering peaks and pristine lakes that defined this corner of the American wilderness. Marcus was an unusual child for his generation, preferring books about survival and nature documentaries to video games and social media. His bedroom walls were covered with maps of national parks, and his bookshelf overflowed with field guides to local flora and fauna. He could identify animal tracks in mud, knew which berries were safe to eat, and had memorized the basic principles of wilderness survival from countless hours spent reading about explorers and adventurers who had conquered the world's most challenging environments. The Chen family arrived at their usual campsite on Friday, October 15th, setting up their blue dome tent in a familiar clearing beside Lake McDonald, the largest lake in the park. The weather forecast called for clear skies and mild temperatures, perfect conditions for hiking, fishing, and the stargazing sessions that Marcus loved most about their annual trips. David had planned an ambitious 3-day itinerary that would take them along several scenic trails he had researched throughout the summer months. Saturday morning dawned bright and cold, with frost covering their tent and the distant mountain peaks glowing pink in the early sunlight. After a breakfast of camp coffee and instant oatmeal, the family set out on the Avalanche Lake Trail, a moderate 4.6-mile round-trip hike that they had completed successfully during previous visits. Marcus walked ahead of his parents, his small backpack filled with snacks, water, and the junior ranger notebook where he recorded his observations about wildlife and plant life. The trail wound through dense cedar and hemlock forests, following Avalanche Creek as it tumbled down from the eye. High country and a series of cascading waterfalls and crystal-clear pools. Marcus stopped frequently to examine interesting rocks, photograph unusual flowers with his disposable camera, and point out bird species to his parents, who marveled at their son's encyclopedic knowledge of the natural world around them. They reached Avalanche Lake around noon, sharing a picnic lunch on the rocky shore while admiring the dramatic glacial cirque that surrounded the pristine alpine water. Towering walls of ancient rock rose nearly vertically from the lake's edge, creating an amphitheater effect that made even normal conversation seem to echo in the thin mountain air. Marcus spent nearly an hour exploring the shoreline, collecting interesting stones and taking careful notes about the ecosystem he observed in the shallow waters near the bank. The family began their return journey around 2:30 p.m., following the same trail they had used to reach the lake. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy of evergreen branches, creating patterns of light and shadow on the forest floor that seemed to shift and dance as they walked. Marcus maintained his position at the front of their small group, occasionally stopping to wait for his parents to catch up or to point out something that had caught his attention along the familiar path. It was at approximately 3:45 p.m., according to David Chen's later testimony to park rangers, that Marcus called out excitedly about spotting what he believed to be a rare species of woodpecker in the trees roughly 50 yards off the main trail. Before his parents could respond or catch up to where he had stopped, Marcus had already pushed through the underbrush to get a closer look at the bird, his bright red jacket disappearing into the dense forest vegetation that grew thick and tangled between the massive tree trunks. David and Linda Chen called out to their son, expecting him to respond immediately or to reappear on the trail within a few moments. When several minutes passed without any sign of Marcus, they became concerned and decided to follow his path into the forest, pushing through the same gap in the underbrush where they had last seen him heading toward the woodpecker he had spotted in the distance. What they found was a small clearing where Marcus had obviously spent some time, evidenced by his fresh footprints in the soft earth and a granola bar wrapper that Linda recognized as coming from their family's camping supplies. But Marcus himself was nowhere to be seen, and there were no obvious signs indicating which direction he might have traveled from that point. The surrounding forest stretched in all directions, dense and unmarked, offering dozens of possible routes that a curious 12-year-old might have chosen to explore. David Chen later described the next few hours as the longest and most terrifying of his entire life. He and Linda called Marcus's name repeatedly, their voices echoing through the forest, and occasionally receiving responses from distant hikers who had heard their shouts but had not seen any sign of a missing boy. They searched in ever-widening circles from the clearing where they had found evidence of Marcus's presence, checking behind large trees, examining creek beds, and looking for any trace of his red jacket or the distinctive hiking boots he had been wearing. As afternoon faded into evening and the temperature began to drop with the setting sun, the Chen family made the difficult decision to return to the main trail and seek help from other hikers and park officials. They encountered a group of experienced backpackers who immediately joined the search effort, spreading out through the forest with flashlights and emergency whistles, calling Marcus's name and checking areas that David and Linda had already searched multiple times. By 8 p.m., with full darkness settling over the mountains and the temperature dropping toward freezing, the search had expanded to include park rangers equipped with high-powered searchlights, emergency medical equipment, and communication devices that could coordinate with additional rescue teams throughout the region. The missing child report was officially filed at 8:47 p.m., triggering a massive search and rescue operation that would eventually involve more than 200 volunteers from across Montana and neighboring states. The initial search focused on a 5-mile radius from the point where Marcus was last seen, based on calculations of how far a 12-year-old child could reasonably travel on foot through difficult terrain in the hours since his disappearance. Search teams worked through the night, using thermal imaging equipment, trained search dogs, and helicopter reconnaissance to cover as much ground as possible before the trail became completely cold. Dawn brought more searchers, including specialized mountain rescue units, volunteer firefighters, and experienced wilderness guides who knew the terrain intimately and could predict where a lost child might seek shelter or attempt to find his way back to civilization. The search expanded to cover nearly 50 square miles of rugged wilderness, encompassing multiple trails, creek systems, and the complex network of game paths that crisscrossed the region. Local media outlets picked up the story by the second day, broadcasting Marcus's photograph and description throughout the Pacific Northwest and drawing additional volunteers who drove hundreds of miles to participate in the search effort. The Chen family established a base camp at park headquarters, coordinating with search teams and providing detailed information about Marcus's experience level, his clothing and equipment, and his likely behavior patterns in a survival situation. Expert. Trackers brought in from other states found occasional signs that might have been left by Marcus, including what appeared to be a child-sized footprint in mud near a creek bank and some broken branches at child height along a game trail. But these clues never led to additional evidence, and the search teams began to suspect that Marcus had either traveled much farther than originally estimated or had encountered some kind of accident that had prevented him from leaving a clear trail to follow. After 2 weeks of intensive searching, involving hundreds of volunteers and covering more than 200 square miles of wilderness, The official search and rescue operation was scaled back to periodic reconnaissance flights and a few dedicated volunteers who continued to explore remote areas that had been difficult to access during the main search effort. The Chen family remained in Montana for another month, hiking familiar trails and checking areas where Marcus might have sought shelter, but they eventually returned to Seattle without their son and without any clear understanding of what had happened to him in the wilderness. The case remained active but unsolved, becoming one of those haunting mysteries that experienced search and rescue professionals never forget. The kind of disappearance that defies logical explanation and leaves families forever wondering what might have been discovered if the search had continued just one more day, or covered just one more hidden valley in the vast wilderness where a 12-year-old boy had simply vanished without a trace, carrying with him a mystery that would not be solved for 5 long years. The story of Marcus Chen's disappearance captured hearts across the nation, becoming one of those cases that haunts everyone who hears it. And today, we want to share with you not just what happened during those terrifying initial days of searching, but the incredible discovery that investigators made 5 years later that still sends chills down the spines of even the most experienced wilderness rescue professionals. Before we dive deeper into this extraordinary tale of survival against impossible odds, we'd love to know where you're watching or listening from today, and if stories of human resilience and unexpected heroism inspire you the way they inspire us. Please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss these incredible true stories that remind us all of the amazing strength of the human spirit. The disappearance of Marcus Chen became a defining moment for the small community of Whitefish, Montana, transforming this quiet mountain town into the epicenter of one of the largest search and rescue operations in the history of Glacier National Park. What started as a family's worst nightmare quickly evolved into a community-wide mission that would test the limits of human determination and reveal the extraordinary lengths that ordinary people will go to help a family in crisis. Within hours of Marcus's disappearance being reported to park authorities, word had spread throughout the tight-knit community of outdoor enthusiasts, retired military personnel, and local business owners who made their living from the tourism industry that depended on the park's pristine wilderness areas. The initial response was immediate and overwhelming, with volunteers arriving at the park's headquarters before dawn on Sunday morning, equipped with their own search gear, emergency supplies, and decades of combined experience navigating the challenging terrain that surrounded the area where Marcus had last been seen. Local business owners shuttered their shops and restaurants to join the search effort, understanding instinctively that finding this missing child took precedence over any commercial considerations. Sarah Mackenzie, who owned a popular breakfast cafe on Whitefish's main street, spent 3 days cooking hot meals for search volunteers, refusing any payment and often working 18-hour shifts to ensure that the men and women combing the wilderness had access to warm food and strong coffee when they returned from their exhausting shifts in the forest. The Whitefish Volunteer Fire Department coordinated with similar units from surrounding communities, creating a command structure that could efficiently deploy dozens of search teams across the vast wilderness area where Marcus might have traveled. Retired military veterans, many of whom had settled in Montana specifically because of their love for the outdoors and their desire to live in a community that valued service and sacrifice, brought specialized skills in navigation, survival techniques, and coordinated search operations that proved invaluable during the critical first 72 hours when Marcus was most likely to be found alive. Dr. Patricia Romero, a child psychologist from the University of Montana who specialized in trauma response, arrived at the search headquarters on the second day to provide support for David and Linda Chen, who were struggling to cope with the overwhelming guilt, fear, and helplessness that comes with losing a child in circumstances beyond their control. Dr. Romero had worked with families during similar crises and understood the complex emotional dynamics that emerge when parents must balance their desperate need to actively participate in the search with the practical reality that their emotional state often made them less effective than trained professionals. The media attention surrounding Marcus's disappearance brought both benefits and challenges to the search operation. National news crews arrived from major networks, broadcasting live updates that helped spread awareness of the missing child case across the entire Pacific Northwest region. The increased visibility led to additional volunteer searchers driving hundreds of miles to participate in the effort, but it also created logistical complications as coordinators struggled to manage the growing number of people who wanted to help while ensuring that the search remained organized and efficient. Local churches throughout the Flathead Valley organized prayer vigils and fundraising efforts to support the Chen family and cover expenses related to the extended search operation. The First Baptist Church of Whitefish established a fund to pay for fuel for search helicopters, while the Catholic parish organized rotating schedules of volunteers who provided meals, childcare for other search volunteers' families, and emotional support for anyone who needed someone to talk to about the stress and heartbreak of searching for a missing child day after day without success. Technology played an increasingly important role as the search progressed beyond the initial emergency response phase. The Montana National Guard provided helicopter reconnaissance flights equipped with thermal imaging cameras capable of detecting body heat signatures from significant distances, while local amateur radio operators established communication networks that allowed search teams to coordinate their efforts across the vast wilderness area, even in locations where cell phone coverage was unreliable or non-existent. Social media platforms became crucial tools for organizing volunteers and sharing information about the search effort. A Facebook page dedicated to finding Marcus Chen attracted thousands of followers from across the country, many of whom shared the posts with their own networks, creating a viral spread of awareness that reached far beyond the immediate geographic region where the search was taking place. The page became a hub for coordinating volunteer schedules, sharing updates from search teams, and providing emotional support for family members and volunteers who were struggling with the physical and emotional demands of the ongoing operation. Professional. Search and rescue teams from neighboring states arrived with specialized equipment including trained search dogs, underwater recovery gear for checking lakes and deep creek pools, and technical climbing equipment that allowed searchers to access steep cliff areas and rocky terrain that would have been impossible to explore safely with standard hiking equipment. These professionals brought not only advanced tools, but also extensive experience with similar cases, helping local coordinators understand which search strategies were most likely to produce results, and which areas should be prioritized based on statistical analysis of previous missing person cases in similar terrain. The psychological impact of the search effort extended far beyond the immediate Chen family, affecting everyone who participated in the daily routine of hoping for good news while preparing emotionally for the possibility that Marcus might never be found alive. Veteran search and rescue volunteers, many of whom had participated in dozens of similar operations over the years, later described the Marcus Chen case as uniquely challenging because of the boy's young age, his apparent wilderness knowledge, and the complete absence of any clear trail or evidence indicating what direction he might have traveled after leaving the main hiking trail. Local schools throughout the Flathead Valley organized awareness campaigns and fundraising drives, with elementary school students creating missing person posters and high school students using their social media networks to spread information about the search effort. Teachers used the situation as an opportunity to discuss wilderness safety, the importance of staying with adult supervision during outdoor activities, and the vital role that community cooperation plays during emergency situations that affect everyone in a small town. The economic impact of the search operation rippled through the local tourism industry, with some visitors canceling planned trips to the area, while others arrived specifically because they wanted to volunteer in the bay. Search effort. Hotels and motels found themselves hosting search volunteers rather than typical tourists, while outdoor equipment stores saw increased sales of flashlights, batteries, and cold weather gear as more people joined the daily search teams that headed into the wilderness before dawn and returned after dark. Religious leaders from various denominations worked together to provide spiritual support for anyone who needed it, regardless of their specific faith background or religious beliefs. The interfaith cooperation that emerged during the search effort created lasting relationships between different religious communities that had previously had limited interaction, demonstrating how crisis situations can sometimes break down barriers and create new forms of community solidarity. As days turned into weeks, the search effort evolved from an emergency response operation into a long-term commitment that required different strategies and different types of community support. Volunteers organized into rotating teams that could maintain consistent search coverage without burning out individual participants, while local businesses continued to provide food, equipment, and financial support for families who had traveled from other states to participate in the search effort. The absence of any concrete evidence about Marcus's fate created a unique form of psychological stress for everyone involved in the search operation. Unlike cases where searchers eventually discover clear evidence of what happened to a missing person, the Marcus Chen case offered no closure, no definitive answers, and no clear point at which the community could transition from active searching to acceptance and grieving. This ambiguity created a situation where hope and despair existed simultaneously, with every day bringing the possibility of a breakthrough discovery, alongside the growing statistical likelihood that Marcus would never be found alive. The dedication, demonstrated by the Whitefish community during those initial weeks of searching, would become legendary among search and rescue professionals throughout the region, representing the kind of sustained community response that emergency coordinators hope for but rarely see in practice. The coordinated effort involving hundreds of volunteers, multiple government agencies, advanced technology, and unwavering community support created a template for missing person responses that would be studied and emulated by emergency management professionals for years to come. However, despite the unprecedented scale and intensity of the search operation, Marcus Chen remained missing, and the initial optimism that had driven the community's response gradually gave way to the sobering realization that this case might join the ranks of unsolved disappearances that haunt mountain communities throughout the American West, leaving families without answers and communities without closure, never knowing that the truth about Marcus's fate would eventually emerge in a way that no one could have possibly anticipated. Detective Rebecca Hawthorne had seen her share of missing person cases during her 15-year career with the Montana State Police. But there was something about the Marcus Chen disappearance that stayed with her long after the active search operations had been scaled back and the media attention had moved on to other stories. At 42 years old, Rebecca was considered one of the most tenacious investigators in the state, known for her methodical approach to cold cases and her refusal to accept that any missing person file should ever be permanently closed without definitive answers about what had happened to the individual in question. Rebecca first became involved with the Marcus Chen case 3 weeks after the boy's disappearance, when the initial search and rescue operations were transitioning from emergency response mode to long-term investigation protocols. Her role was to coordinate with federal agencies, review all physical evidence that had been collected during the search, and establish systematic procedures for following up on tips and potential sightings that continued to come in from across the Pacific Northwest region even after the intensive ground searches had been suspended. Growing up in rural Wyoming as the daughter of a ranch foreman and an elementary school teacher, Rebecca had developed an early appreciation for the vastness and danger of wilderness areas, understanding intuitively how easy it was for someone to become disoriented and lost, even in terrain that seemed familiar and manageable. Her childhood had been filled with camping trips, hunting expeditions with her father, and long horseback rides through mountain country where cell phone coverage was non-existent and self-reliance was not just a philosophical concept but a practical necessity for survival. The path that led Rebecca to law enforcement had been shaped by a personal tragedy that occurred during her senior year of high school, when her younger brother Danny had been killed in a car accident caused by a drunk driver who left the scene and was never identified despite an extensive investigation by local authorities. The experience of watching her family struggle with unanswered questions and the absence of closure had instilled in Rebecca a deep commitment to ensuring that other families would not have to endure the same kind of prolonged uncertainty, an unresolved grief that had marked her own adolescence and early adulthood. After graduating from the University of Montana with degrees in criminal justice and psychology, Rebecca had worked for several years with the Billings Police Department, specializing in cases involving missing children and domestic violence situations that required careful coordination between law enforcement agencies and social services organizations. Her reputation for thorough investigation techniques and her ability to maintain professional composure during emotionally challenging cases had eventually led to her recruitment by the state police, where she was assigned to a specialized unit that handled complex cases requiring multi-jurisdictional cooperation and advanced investigative resources. The Marcus Chen case presented unique challenges that distinguished it from other missing person investigations Rebecca had supervised. During her career, the remote location of the disappearance, the complete absence of witnesses after the initial separation from his parents, and the extensive wilderness terrain that would need to be covered during any comprehensive search operation created logistical and practical obstacles that went far beyond typical missing person protocols used in urban or suburban environments where surveillance cameras, cell phone records, and witness interviews could usually provide investigators with clear timelines and potential leads to pursue. Rebecca's first step in taking over the investigation was to conduct comprehensive interviews with David and Linda Chen, focusing not only on the events immediately surrounding Marcus's disappearance, but also on his personality traits, survival knowledge, physical capabilities, and behavioral patterns that might provide insights into his likely actions and decision-making processes during a crisis situation. These interviews revealed that Marcus was far more wilderness-savvy than most children his age, with extensive knowledge of edible plants, water purification techniques, and basic shelter construction methods that he had learned through years of reading survival guides and watching nature documentaries. The evidence room at the Montana State Police headquarters contained only a few physical items related to the Marcus Chen case. The granola bar wrapper found at the clearing where he had last been definitively located, plaster casts of footprints that might or might not have been made by the missing boy, and photographs of the search area taken from helicopters during the initial operations. Rebecca spent hours examining these materials, looking for details that might have been overlooked during the chaotic early days of the search, when the focus had been on covering as much ground as possible, rather than conducting detailed forensic analysis of potential evidence. The case files also contained hundreds of pages of reports from search team leaders, volunteer coordinators, and federal agencies that had participated in the operation, creating a comprehensive record of everywhere that had been searched, which techniques had been employed, and what environmental factors might have influenced Marcus's survival chances during the critical first days after his disappearance. Rebecca methodically reviewed each report, creating detailed maps that showed search coverage and identifying potential gaps where additional investigation might still yield useful information. One aspect of the case that particularly intrigued Rebecca was the complete absence of any confirmed sightings or evidence after Marcus left the main hiking trail, despite the hundreds of experienced outdoors enthusiasts who had combed the area during the weeks following his disappearance. In her experience, missing person cases in wilderness areas usually produced at least some trace evidence, even if the individual was never found alive, because the natural environment tends to preserve certain types of physical evidence for extended periods of time when weather conditions are favorable. Rebecca began developing theories about what might have happened to Marcus based on her analysis of similar cases from other regions and her consultation with wilderness survival experts who could provide insights into the realistic survival prospects for a 12-year-old child in the specific environmental conditions that existed in Glacier National Park during October. These consultations revealed that while Marcus's survival knowledge was impressive for his age, the combination of cold nighttime temperatures, limited food sources, and the psychological stress of being lost and alone would have created life-threatening challenges within the first 72 hours after his disappearance. The investigation also required Rebecca to coordinate with federal agencies, including the National Park Service, the FBI's Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Team, and specialized units within the Department of Homeland Security that had resources and expertise not available to state and local law enforcement agencies. This coordination involved navigating complex jurisdictional issues, since Marcus's disappearance had occurred on federal land, but the investigation was being conducted primarily by state authorities, with assistance from local agencies that had been involved in the initial search operations. Rebecca established systematic procedures for following up on reported sightings of Marcus that continued to come in sporadically from across the region. Even though most of these reports proved to be cases of mistaken identity or well-meaning individuals who thought they had seen someone matching Marcus's description in locations hundreds of miles from where he had disappeared. Each report required careful investigation and documentation, since even unlikely sightings could potentially provide valuable information about Marcus's fate or help eliminate certain possibilities from consideration. The psychological aspects of the case presented additional challenges that Rebecca had to address while maintaining her professional objectivity and investigative focus. Working with the Chen family required constant sensitivity to their emotional state and their desperate need for any information about their son's fate, while also managing their expectations about the realistic likelihood of finding Marcus alive. After so much time had passed without any confirmed evidence of his survival or location, Rebecca also had to coordinate with mental health professionals who were providing support services to the numerous volunteers who had participated in the search operations, many of whom were struggling with feelings of failure and inadequacy related to their inability to locate Marcus despite their extensive efforts and genuine commitment to helping his family. The emotional toll of unsuccessful search operations can be severe for volunteers who invest significant time and energy in efforts that ultimately produce no tangible results or closure for the affected families. As months passed without any significant developments in the case, Rebecca found herself thinking about Marcus Chen during her off-duty hours, wondering what kind of person he might have become if he had survived his ordeal in the wilderness and somehow managed to avoid detection by the extensive search operations that had been conducted throughout the region. She knew from her experience with other long-term missing person cases that maintaining hope while accepting realistic limitations was one of the most challenging aspects of investigative work, requiring a delicate balance between persistent effort and practical acceptance of the constraints imposed by available evidence and resources. Rebecca's commitment to the Marcus Chen case went beyond her official responsibilities as the lead investigator, reflecting her personal understanding of how unresolved disappearances could affect entire communities and her determination to ensure that every possible investigative avenue would be explored before the case was relegated to the inactive files that contained dozens of similar unsolved mysteries from across Montana's vast wilderness areas. The case had become a defining challenge of Rebecca's career, representing everything she believed about the importance of thorough investigation, community cooperation, and the responsibility that law enforcement professionals have to families who are depending on them to find answers about their missing loved ones, even when those answers seem increasingly unlikely to emerge through conventional investigative methods, and even when years pass without any significant developments or breakthroughs that might provide new directions for the ongoing search efforts. Rebecca. Hawthorne's dedication to missing person cases had roots that ran deeper than professional obligation, stemming from a childhood tragedy that had fundamentally shaped her understanding of how unresolved disappearances could devastate families and communities for generations. When Rebecca was 16 years old, her 8-year-old cousin Jamie had vanished during a family reunion camping trip in the Wind River Range of Wyoming, disappearing between the time she went to bed in her family's tent and dawn the next morning. When her parents discovered her empty sleeping bag and realized that their youngest daughter was nowhere to be found. The search for Jamie had consumed Rebecca's extended family for 3 agonizing weeks, With dozens of relatives, friends, and volunteers scouring the rugged mountain terrain, while Rebecca watched her aunt and uncle transform from confident, optimistic parents into hollow-eyed strangers who seemed to age years with each passing day that brought no news about their missing daughter. The investigation had ultimately concluded that Jamie had likely sleepwalked out of the family tent and become disoriented in the darkness, falling into one of the many deep ravines or swift-moving streams that characterized the wilderness area, where they had been camping. Rebecca had been old enough during Jamie's disappearance to understand the devastating impact that unanswered questions could have on a family's ability to grieve and move forward with their lives. She had watched her Aunt Linda develop severe depression and anxiety that required years of therapy and medication, while her Uncle Mike had thrown himself into work with an obsessive intensity that eventually destroyed his marriage and his relationship with his surviving children. The ripple effects of Jamie's disappearance had spread throughout their extended family, creating lasting tensions and unresolved grief that continued to influence family gatherings and relationships more than 25 years later. The experience had taught Rebecca that missing person cases were never just about the individual who had disappeared, but about the entire network of family members, friends, and community members whose lives would be forever altered by the absence of definitive answers about what had happened to their loved one. This understanding had driven her to pursue a career in law enforcement, with a specific focus on missing person investigations, and it explained her unwillingness to accept that any case should be considered closed without conclusive evidence about the fate of the missing individual. Rebecca's approach to the Marcus Chen case was also influenced by her experiences as a mother of 2 teenage children, which gave her a visceral understanding of the terror that David and Linda Chen must have felt when they realized their son had vanished in the wilderness. Her own children, Sarah and Michael, were experienced hikers and campers who had accompanied Rebecca on numerous outdoor adventures throughout Montana and Wyoming, but she knew that even the most prepared and knowledgeable children could make poor decisions or encounter unexpected dangers that could quickly transform a routine outdoor activity into a life-threatening emergency. The parallel between Marcus's disappearance and her cousin Jamie's fate was not lost on Rebecca. Though she was careful not to let her personal experiences bias her investigative approach or cloud her professional judgment about the most likely explanations for what had happened to the missing boy. Both cases involved children who had vanished in wilderness areas during family camping trips. Both had triggered extensive search operations that failed to produce any conclusive evidence, and both had left families struggling with the psychological torment of not knowing whether their loved one was alive or dead. Rebecca's personal connection to similar cases had taught her that families of missing persons often went through predictable stages of hope, denial, anger, and eventual acceptance, but that the timeline for these emotional transitions varied dramatically, depending on the specific circumstances of each disappearance and the personality traits of individual family members. Some families maintained hope for years or even decades after a disappearance, while others reached a point of acceptance relatively quickly and focused their energy on memorializing their lost loved one rather than continuing to search for answers that might never come. The Chen family had demonstrated remarkable resilience during the first year after Marcus's disappearance, maintaining their hope that he might still be found alive while also working to establish a foundation that would provide resources and support for other families dealing with missing person cases in wilderness areas. David and Linda had become advocates for improved search and rescue protocols, better communication systems for remote areas, and increased funding for the specialized equipment and training that could make the difference between successful recoveries and unsolved disappearances. Rebecca had developed a deep respect for the Chen family's determination to channel their grief into constructive action that might help prevent other families from experiencing similar tragedies. She had seen many families become consumed by bitterness and anger after losing a loved one to unexplained circumstances, but David and Linda had somehow managed to maintain their focus on positive contributions that could honor Marcus's memory while potentially saving other lives in the future. The psychological burden of working on long-term missing person cases had taken its own toll on Rebecca over the years, requiring her to develop coping strategies that would allow her to maintain her emotional equilibrium while remaining fully committed to each investigation. She had learned to compartmentalize her personal feelings about individual cases, focusing on the methodical investigation techniques that gave her the best chance of uncovering new evidence or identifying previously overlooked leads that might advance an investigation. Rebecca's marriage to her college sweetheart Tom had survived the stresses of her demanding career, but not without challenges related to the emotional intensity of her work and the irregular hours that missing person investigations often required. Tom, who worked as a high school mathematics teacher, had learned to recognize the signs that Rebecca was becoming too personally invested in a particular case, and he had developed gentle ways of reminding her to maintain healthy boundaries between her professional responsibilities and her personal life. The support of her family had been crucial during the most difficult periods of Rebecca's career, particularly during cases involving missing children, where the parallels to her own family's tragedy became emotionally overwhelming. Tom and their children had learned to give Rebecca space to process her feelings about challenging cases, while also providing the stability and normalcy that helped her maintain perspective about the importance of her work within the broader context of her life and relationships. Rebecca's colleagues at the Montana State Police had also become an important source of professional and emotional support, particularly the other investigators who specialized in missing person cases and understood the unique psychological demands of work that often involved helping families cope with worst-case scenarios and unresolved grief. The informal network of law enforcement professionals who worked on similar cases throughout the region had developed their own support systems and communication channels that helped individual investigators avoid the isolation and burnout that could compromise their effectiveness or their mental health. The Marcus Chen case had become particularly significant for Rebecca because it represented many of the most challenging aspects of missing person investigations. A remote location that made evidence collection difficult, a victim who possessed survival skills that complicated predictions about likely outcomes, a family that maintained hope despite increasingly slim odds of a positive resolution, and a timeline that had stretched long enough to transition from emergency response to cold case investigation without producing any definitive answers about what had happened. Rebecca's personal investment in the case went beyond her professional responsibilities, reflecting her belief that every missing person deserved to have someone who would continue searching for answers long after media attention had faded and public interest had moved on to other stories. She knew that the Chen family was depending on her persistence and expertise to eventually uncover the truth about Marcus's fate, and she was determined not to let them down the way she felt the investigators in her cousin Jamie's case had ultimately failed her own family. The weight of these expectations, combined with her personal understanding of how unresolved disappearances could affect families for decades, had made the Marcus Chen case a defining challenge of Rebecca's career, and a constant reminder of why she had chosen to dedicate her professional life to helping families find answers about their missing loved ones, even when those answers seemed increasingly unlikely to emerge through conventional investigative methods, and even when years passed, without significant developments or breakthroughs that might provide new directions for ongoing search efforts. This personal connection to the pain of unresolved loss would drive Rebecca to continue investigating the Marcus Chen case with unwavering determination, never knowing that her persistence would eventually lead to discoveries that would challenge everything she thought she understood about survival, resilience, and the extraordinary things that human beings could accomplish when faced with seemingly impossible circumstances in the wilderness areas that had claimed so many lives throughout the history of the American West. The pattern that emerged over the years following Marcus Chen's disappearance was both heartbreaking and mystifying to everyone who remained connected to the case, as sporadic reports continued to trickle in from across the greater Yellowstone ecosystem about possible sightings of a young person living alone in the wilderness, always just beyond the reach of confirmation, and always leaving investigators like Rebecca Hawthorne wondering whether they were chasing shadows or following legitimate leads that might finally provide answers about what had happened to the missing boy. These reports came from an eclectic mix of sources throughout Montana, Wyoming, and northern Idaho, each offering tantalizing glimpses of what might have been Marcus Chen, but never providing enough concrete evidence to justify launching another full-scale search operation in the vast wilderness areas where such sightings were reported. Experienced hikers would call local sheriff's departments to report seeing smoke from what appeared to be a small, expertly constructed fire in remote locations where no camping permits had been issued, while hunters would describe fleeting encounters with a figure who seemed to vanish into the forest before they could get close enough to make positive identification. The most intriguing reports came from backcountry guides and wilderness photographers, who spent extended periods in remote areas and possessed the experience to distinguish between ordinary campers and someone who appeared to be living permanently in the wilderness, using survival techniques that went far beyond typical recreational camping skills. These observers described evidence of sophisticated shelter construction, including lean-tos and debris huts that showed advanced knowledge of insulation and weather protection principles, as well as signs of hunting and food preservation activities. That suggested someone was successfully obtaining nutrition from wild sources over extended periods. Dr. Amanda Foster, a wildlife biologist who conducted research on elk migration patterns throughout the region, had reported 3 separate encounters over a 2-year period with what she described as an individual who appeared to be living off the land in areas of the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness that were rarely visited by recreational hikers due to their remoteness and challenging terrain. Dr. Foster's scientific training and extensive backcountry experience lent credibility to her observations, which consistently described someone who seemed to move through the forest with unusual stealth and awareness of animal behavior patterns. According to Dr. Foster's detailed reports, the figure she had observed from a distance appeared to be a young person of small stature, who demonstrated remarkable ability to remain undetected in environments where most people would have difficulty moving quietly or finding adequate shelter. On one occasion, she had discovered the remains of an expertly constructed fish trap in a mountain stream, using techniques that required sophisticated understanding of water flow patterns and fish behavior that would be unusual for recreational campers but entirely consistent with someone who depended on such methods for regular nutrition. Rebecca had personally interviewed Dr. Foster on multiple occasions, finding her to be a credible and careful observer who was reluctant to speculate beyond what she had actually witnessed, but confident in her assessment that someone was living permanently in areas where survival would require exceptional skills and knowledge. The locations of these sightings formed a pattern that roughly corresponded to seasonal migration routes used by elk and other large game animals, suggesting that whoever was responsible for the evidence Dr. Foster had discovered understood how to take advantage of natural food sources that varied throughout the year. Similar reports came from professional hunting guides who worked in the region during hunting seasons, several of whom had discovered evidence of sophisticated snares and deadfall traps that were clearly not the work of recreational hunters or typical wilderness visitors. These traps demonstrated advanced knowledge of animal behavior and showed construction techniques that were more consistent with traditional survival methods than with modern hunting practices, suggesting that whoever had built them was relying on these devices for subsistence rather than sport or recreational purposes. Tom Bradley, a hunting guide with 30 years of experience in the Montana wilderness, had photographed several of these trap sites and shared his images with Rebecca during a detailed interview about his observations. Bradley's photographs showed trap construction that required intimate knowledge of local game trails, animal feeding patterns, and seasonal behavior changes that would take years of careful observation to develop, leading him to conclude that whoever was responsible had been living in the area for an extended period and had developed exceptional wilderness survival skills. The psychological profile that Rebecca had developed based on these scattered reports suggested someone who had successfully adapted to long-term wilderness survival by developing highly refined skills in hunting, foraging, shelter construction, and predator avoidance. The pattern of sightings indicated someone who was deliberately avoiding contact with other people while maintaining the ability to observe human activity from concealment, suggesting both sophisticated survival instincts and possible social anxiety or trauma that made interaction with civilization threatening or undesirable. Rebecca had consulted with military survival experts and anthropologists who studied traditional hunting and gathering societies to better understand what kind of skills and knowledge would be required for someone to survive alone in the wilderness for extended periods. These experts confirmed that while such survival was theoretically possible, it would require exceptional physical and mental adaptation, extensive knowledge of local flora and fauna, and probably some access to basic tools or materials that would be difficult to manufacture from purely natural sources. The seasonal pattern of sightings also provided important clues about survival strategies, with most reports occurring during spring and summer months when food sources were most abundant, and weather conditions were most favorable for outdoor survival. The apparent absence of sightings during harsh winter months suggested either that the individual had found secure shelter in locations that were completely inaccessible to observers, or that they possessed advanced cold weather survival skills that allowed them to remain active and mobile even during periods when most wildlife became scarce and temperatures regularly dropped below freezing. Rebecca had mapped all confirmed and potential sightings using geographic information systems that allowed her to identify patterns and relationships between different observation points, creating a detailed picture of movement patterns that seemed to follow natural corridors through the wilderness while avoiding areas with heavy human activity. The resulting map showed a territory covering several hundred square miles of some of the most remote and challenging terrain in the northern Rocky Mountains, suggesting that whoever was responsible for these sightings had developed an intimate knowledge of the landscape that would take years to acquire. The investigation had also revealed that several backcountry research stations and remote fire lookout towers had reported minor thefts of basic supplies over the years, including batteries, first aid materials, and non-perishable food items. While these incidents could have been the work of any number of individuals, the pattern of what was taken and what was left behind suggested someone who took only essential survival items and was careful not to take enough to compromise the operations of these facilities or endanger the people who depended on them. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a Forest Service researcher who managed a remote weather monitoring station in the Bob Marshall Wilderness, had reported finding evidence that someone had been using her facility's emergency shelter during severe weather events, always leaving the space clean and undamaged, and sometimes even leaving behind small improvements like additional firewood or minor repairs to equipment. Dr. Mitchell's observations suggested someone who understood the protocols and ethics of backcountry survival and was respectful of the resources that others needed for their own safety and research activities. The cumulative weight of these reports had convinced Rebecca that someone was indeed living long-term in the wilderness areas surrounding Glacier National Park, but the identity of this individual remained a complete mystery that could potentially be connected to Marcus Chen's disappearance or could represent an entirely separate situation involving a different person who had chosen or been forced to adopt a lifestyle of complete self-sufficiency in one of the most challenging environments in North America. The frustrating aspect of all these potential sightings was their consistent lack of conclusive evidence that could definitively link any of the observations to Marcus Chen specifically, leaving Rebecca in the position of having compelling circumstantial evidence that someone matching his general description might have survived his disappearance, but lacking the proof necessary to justify the resources that would be required for another intensive search operation in the vast wilderness areas where these sightings had occurred. The pattern of reports had created a growing sense among investigators and the Chen family that Marcus might still be alive somewhere in the wilderness. But this hope was tempered by the realistic understanding that even if the sightings were accurate, locating someone who had successfully avoided detection for years in hundreds of square miles of remote terrain would require an enormous investment of resources with no guarantee of success, leaving everyone connected to the case in a state of prolonged uncertainty that was both emotionally draining and professionally challenging for the investigators who remained committed to finding definitive answers. The growing collection of wilderness sightings and unexplained evidence had begun to attract attention from sources far beyond the local law enforcement community. As word spread through networks of outdoor enthusiasts, survival experts, and amateur investigators who were fascinated by the possibility that someone might be successfully living off the land in one of North America's most challenging wilderness environments. Online forums dedicated to missing person cases and wilderness survival began featuring lengthy discussions about the Marcus Chen disappearance, with contributors sharing their own theories about the scattered reports and debating whether the evidence pointed to a genuine long-term survival situation or a series of unrelated incidents that had been mistakenly connected by investigators desperate to find answers. The Reddit community R Unresolved Mysteries had created a comprehensive thread about Marcus's case that had attracted thousands of comments from users around the world, many of whom had personal experience with wilderness survival, search and rescue operations, or missing person investigations. These online discussions had generated additional tips and potential sightings as people who might never have contacted law enforcement directly felt comfortable sharing their observations in an anonymous online environment where they could contribute to the investigation without becoming personally involved in official proceedings. Several experienced wilderness survival instructors had reached out to Rebecca directly after learning about the case through social media platforms, offering their expertise in analyzing the evidence and their insights into what kinds of skills and knowledge would be required for long-term survival in the specific environmental conditions found throughout the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. These experts had provided detailed assessments of the shelter construction techniques, hunting methods, and foraging strategies that would be necessary for someone to survive alone in the wilderness for extended periods, helping Rebecca understand whether the reported evidence was consistent with genuine survival activities or more likely explained by other factors. Jack Morrison, a former Special Forces survival instructor who had spent 20 years training military personnel in wilderness survival techniques, had volunteered his time to review all the photographic evidence that had been collected from various sighting locations throughout the region. Morrison's analysis had confirmed that the shelters, traps, and other constructed items showed sophisticated understanding of survival principles and demonstrated construction techniques that would be difficult for most people to master without extensive training or years of practical experience in similar environments. According to Morrison's professional assessment, the evidence suggested someone who had either received formal survival training at some point or had developed exceptional skills through extended trial-and-error learning in a wilderness environment where mistakes could be fatal. The level of sophistication shown in the trap construction and shelter building indicated knowledge that went far beyond what most people could learn from books or television programs, suggesting either prior military or specialized outdoor training, or alternatively, years of practical experience gained through actual wilderness living conditions. The involvement of survival experts had also helped Rebecca understand some of the seasonal patterns that characterized the various sightings and evidence discoveries throughout the region. Morrison explained that someone living permanently in the wilderness would need to develop detailed knowledge of seasonal food sources, weather patterns, and animal behavior cycles that would allow them to anticipate and prepare for the dramatic environmental changes that occurred throughout the year in mountain ecosystems where temperatures could vary by 60 degrees between summer and winter months. Local Native American tribal leaders had also expressed interest in the case, particularly members of the Blackfeet Nation and the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, who had traditional knowledge of survival techniques that had been used in the region for thousands of years before European settlement. Tribal elder Robert Crowfeather had met with Rebecca to discuss traditional hunting and gathering methods that might explain some of the evidence that had been discovered, offering insights into how indigenous peoples had historically survived in similar environments using techniques that required intimate knowledge of local ecosystems and natural resource management. Crowfeather's explanation of traditional survival methods had provided Rebecca with a new perspective on some of the evidence that had been collected, particularly the sophisticated food preservation techniques that had been observed at several sites and the apparent understanding of seasonal resource availability that seemed to characterize the movement patterns suggested by the various sighting locations. The tribal elder had emphasized that successful long-term wilderness survival required not just technical skills, but also a deep spiritual and psychological connection to the natural environment that allowed someone to remain mentally stable and emotionally balanced during extended periods of isolation and physical hardship. The case had also attracted attention from academic researchers who studied human adaptation to extreme environments, including anthropologists, psychologists, and survival medicine specialists who were interested in the physiological and psychological factors that would influence someone's ability to survive alone in wilderness conditions for extended periods. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a medical anthropologist from Montana State University, had contacted Rebecca to offer her expertise in analyzing the behavioral patterns suggested by the evidence, and to discuss the likelihood that someone could maintain physical and mental health while living under such conditions. Dr. Vasquez's research had focused on historical cases of individuals who had lived alone in wilderness environments for extended periods, including hermits, castaways, and people who had chosen to reject civilization in favor of subsistence living in remote areas. Her studies had revealed that successful long-term wilderness survival required not only technical skills and physical resilience, but also exceptional psychological adaptability and the ability to maintain mental clarity and emotional stability. Without regular human contact or social support systems, the academic interest in Marcus's case had led to several published research papers and conference presentations that examined the evidence from various professional perspectives, bringing additional expertise and resources to bear on questions that had puzzled investigators for years. These scholarly analyses had helped refine understanding of what would be required for someone to survive under the conditions suggested by the evidence, while also identifying aspects of the case that remained unexplained or inconsistent with typical patterns observed in similar situations. Media attention had also intensified as the case gained notoriety through social media platforms and online discussions, with several television programs featuring segments about Marcus's disappearance and the subsequent mysterious sightings throughout the region. The increased publicity had generated additional tips and potential sightings from across the country, though most of these reports proved to be cases of mistaken identity or well-meaning individuals who had confused Marcus's case with other missing person situations. The television coverage had included interviews with survival experts, search and rescue professionals, and family members who provided different perspectives on the likelihood that Marcus could have survived his initial disappearance and successfully adapted to long-term wilderness living. These programs had helped educate the public about the challenges and requirements of wilderness survival, while also maintaining awareness of Marcus's case and encouraging anyone with relevant information to contact law enforcement authorities. The Chen family had participated selectively in media interviews, balancing their desire to maintain public awareness of Marcus's case with their need to protect their privacy and emotional well-being during what had become a prolonged and emotionally exhausting ordeal. David and Linda Chen had established a foundation dedicated to supporting search and rescue operations and wilderness safety education, channeling their energy into constructive activities that honored Marcus's memory, while potentially helping prevent similar tragedies from affecting other families. The foundation's work had brought the Chen family into contact with other families who had lost loved ones in wilderness areas, creating a support network of people who understood the unique challenges of coping with disappearances in remote environments where conventional search methods were often inadequate and where the vast scale of the landscape made comprehensive investigation extremely difficult and resource-intensive. Professional search and rescue organizations had also begun using Marcus's case as a training example and case study for developing improved protocols for missing person searches in wilderness environments, analyzing the decisions and strategies that had been employed during the initial search operations, and identifying potential improvements that might increase the likelihood of successful outcomes in similar future situations. The ongoing interest from multiple professional communities had created an unusual situation where Marcus's case remained active and visible years after most missing person investigations would have been relegated to cold case files, maintaining pressure on investigators to continue pursuing leads and following up on potential sightings, even when the likelihood of finding definitive answers seemed to diminish with each passing month. This sustained attention from diverse sources had convinced Rebecca that the evidence was compelling enough to justify continued investigation. Even though the practical challenges of locating someone who had successfully avoided detection for years in vast wilderness areas made the prospects for a successful resolution seem increasingly remote as time passed without any breakthrough. Discoveries or conclusive evidence about Marcus's ultimate fate. The breakthrough that would finally provide answers to the Marcus Chen mystery came in the most unexpected way possible, during a routine aerial survey conducted by Montana Fish, wildlife and parks biologists who were studying wolfpack territories in the remote backcountry areas surrounding the North Fork of the Flathead River. Dr. Michael Patterson, a wildlife biologist with 15 years of experience tracking large, predator populations throughout the northern Rocky Mountains, was piloting a small aircraft equipped with high-resolution cameras and GPS tracking equipment when he spotted something that immediately caught his attention in a valley that was virtually inaccessible to ground-based researchers and had never been thoroughly surveyed during any of the previous search operations for Marcus Chen. From his aerial vantage point, roughly 1,000 feet above the forest canopy, Dr. Patterson could clearly see what appeared to be a sophisticated network of structures and cleared areas that were obviously human-made, but showed none of the characteristics typical of recreational camping or standard wilderness activities. The structures included multiple shelter areas that demonstrated advanced construction techniques, carefully planned food storage systems that were designed to protect supplies from both weather and wildlife, and an intricate system of trails and pathways that connected different functional areas within what appeared to be a permanent settlement designed for long-term habitation by someone with exceptional wilderness survival skills. Dr. Patterson immediately contacted park authorities and law enforcement agencies, providing GPS coordinates for the location and detailed photographs that he had taken during his aerial survey. The images showed evidence of human habitation that was far more sophisticated than anything that had been discovered during previous investigations, including what appeared to be multiple seasonal shelters, extensive food preservation and storage facilities, and even what looked like basic workshop areas where tools and equipment were being manufactured or repaired using primitive but effective techniques. Rebecca Hawthorne received the call about Dr. Patterson's discovery on a Tuesday morning in late September, exactly 5 years and 11 months after Marcus Chen had first disappeared during his family's camping trip to Glacier National Park. The timing seemed almost symbolic, as Rebecca had been preparing to meet with the Chen family later that week to discuss the possibility of officially changing Marcus's case status from active investigation to presumed deceased, a decision that would have profound legal and emotional implications for everyone who had remained invested in finding answers about the missing boy's fate. Instead of preparing for that difficult conversation, Rebecca found herself coordinating the most complex and challenging search operation of her entire career, as the remote location of the discovered settlement required specialized equipment, experienced mountaineers, and carefully planned logistics that would allow investigators to access an area that had never been reached by ground-based searchers during any of the previous operations. The valley where Dr. Patterson had made his discovery was surrounded by steep cliffs and dense forests that made helicopter landing impossible, requiring search teams to rappel from aircraft or attempt extremely difficult overland approaches that could take several days of dangerous travel through unmarked wilderness terrain. The decision to launch an immediate investigation was complicated by weather conditions that were rapidly deteriorating as autumn transitioned toward winter, with early snowfall already making high-altitude travel dangerous and unpredictable. Rebecca knew that if the settlement was indeed connected to Marcus Chen's disappearance, this might represent the last realistic opportunity to investigate the site before winter weather made access completely impossible for several months, potentially destroying evidence or creating conditions that could prove fatal for anyone who might still be living in such a remote location. Federal agencies, including the FBI, National Park Service, and U.S. Forest Service immediately provided resources and personnel for what was designated as a high-priority missing person recovery operation, with specialized teams including mountain rescue experts, forensic investigators, and medical personnel being assembled within hours of Dr. Patterson's initial report. The coordination required for such a complex operation in such challenging terrain represented one of the largest law enforcement responses ever mounted in the region, reflecting both the significance of the potential discovery and the extreme difficulty of conducting any kind of investigation in such an inaccessible location. The actual approach to the settlement required nearly 12 hours of dangerous travel by a team of 8 specialists who rappelled from helicopters at the edge of the valley and then navigated through dense forest and steep terrain while carrying all the equipment and supplies they would need for what could potentially become a multi-day operation depending on what they discovered at the site. Rebecca was part of the advance team, despite concerns from her supervisors about the risks involved in such a challenging operation, because her intimate knowledge of the Marcus Chen case and her experience with missing person investigations made her presence essential for properly evaluating whatever evidence might be discovered. As the search team approached the coordinates provided by Dr. Patterson, they began to encounter signs of human habitation that were far more extensive and sophisticated than anything that had been suggested by the aerial photographs. The trail system that connected different areas of the settlement showed evidence of years of careful maintenance and improvement, with bridges constructed over streams, stone steps carved into steep hillsides, and drainage systems that demonstrated advanced understanding of water management principles that would be essential for long-term survival in an environment that experienced dramatic seasonal variations in precipitation and temperature. The first structure they encountered was a workshop area that contained an impressive array of tools and equipment that had obviously been manufactured from salvaged materials and natural resources found in the surrounding environment. Hand-forged knives, carefully constructed bows and arrows, fishing equipment made from carved bone and plant fibers, and even basic metalworking tools suggested someone who had developed remarkable skills in traditional craftsmanship and had successfully created everything necessary for independent survival without access to modern manufactured goods. Rebecca's heart was pounding as the team moved deeper into the settlement, finding evidence of hunting success, food preservation activities, and seasonal preparation that indicated someone had not only survived in this location, but had actually thrived, developing a sustainable lifestyle that could theoretically continue indefinitely as long as the individual remained healthy and able to maintain the complex systems they had created for obtaining food, shelter, and other necessities of life in such a challenging environment. The main shelter was a masterpiece of wilderness construction, built into a natural rock formation that provided protection from weather while offering excellent concealment from aerial observation and incorporating design features that would maintain comfortable temperatures even during harsh winter conditions. Inside the shelter, the search team discovered personal items that immediately confirmed their hopes and fears about the identity of the settlement's inhabitant, including a partially deteriorated jacket that matched the description of clothing Marcus Chen had been wearing when he disappeared, along with handwritten notes and journals that documented years of survival experiences in Marcus's distinctive handwriting. The journals revealed the incredible story of how Marcus had survived, his initial disorientation and terror after becoming separated from his parents, gradually developing the skills and knowledge necessary for long-term wilderness survival through a combination of his extensive reading about survival techniques, careful observation of natural processes, and sheer determination to stay alive, despite facing challenges that would have defeated most adults with far more experience and resources. But Marcus was not at the settlement when the search team arrived, and evidence suggested that he had left the area several days earlier, possibly in response to the increased aerial surveillance that had been conducted throughout the region as part of Dr. Patterson's wildlife research project. Tracking evidence indicated that Marcus had departed carrying essential supplies and equipment, suggesting that he had developed contingency plans for abandoning his established settlement if circumstances required him to relocate to maintain his privacy and security. The discovery of Marcus's settlement proved that he had not only survived his disappearance, but had successfully adapted to wilderness, living with remarkable skill and ingenuity, transforming from a lost 12-year-old boy into a capable young man who had mastered one of the most challenging lifestyles imaginable. However, his absence from the settlement created a new phase of the investigation, as authorities now had to locate someone who had spent years perfecting his ability to avoid detection and who clearly possessed the skills and knowledge necessary to disappear again if he chose to do so. Rebecca knew that finding Marcus now would require a completely different approach than traditional search and rescue operations, since they were no longer looking for a victim who needed to be rescued, but rather for someone who had chosen to live apart from civilization and might not welcome contact with the outside world that he had successfully avoided for nearly 6 years. The investigation that began with a missing child had evolved into something far more complex and challenging, requiring law enforcement professionals to balance their responsibility to verify Marcus's safety and well-being with respect for his apparent choice to live independently in the wilderness, creating legal and ethical questions that had never been encountered in previous missing person cases. If this incredible story of survival against impossible odds has moved you as much as it has moved us, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss these amazing true stories that remind us all of the extraordinary strength and resilience of the human spirit. And stay tuned because the final chapter of Marcus Chen's remarkable journey is still being written in the wilderness areas where he learned to transform tragedy into triumph through sheer determination and unbreakable will to survive.